for this. There it is, waiting on the cue. Okay. When there's music, there's a new round and new chances. And for this one, I'd actually like to start right away by hearing from you. So if you could all take out your phones, then we should have the Slido link in a little bit behind us because, of course, I don't have to re-emphasize the interlinkage that needs to be made between climate and health, right? I mean, we have heard the statistics from EVP Šefčovič just earlier when we did the opening. We've heard just now in the panel what the importance is. But I want to hear from you. What do you think are the most direct health-related consequences of living in a warming planet? And the more creative you are, the more bonus points you will get from me. Heat waves is one we've heard. Air pollution was also mentioned, of course. I will take out my tablet to follow along right with you. Let's see. Excessive heat, physical and mental health. Yeah, that's one that we've also heard specifically, indeed, people from my generation that also suffer from that. Depression, indeed. There are even terms that we're coining right now that are to do with climate depression or eco-anxiety. So we're really seeing some effect there. Infectious diseases, Ron, depression, lesser well-being, heat stroke, storms, food security, anxiety, mental health, they're becoming bigger and bigger. Loss of livelihood. Of course, it's not the most optimistically making word cloud, but in a way it does really lay a focus on the importance of this, right? The importance of the issue and the widespreadness of it. And that is what this next plenary session will be all about. We'll have an amazing lineup of speakers, again, who will give some presentations, and then after each presentation there will be room for one Slido question, so please do keep sending them in, but there will be a lot more room towards the end of it, because then we will do a full-fledged panel. And I think, as you continue to fill this out, that I won't keep you in suspense any longer, and I'll just call forward our very first speaker for this plenary session. So may I once again ask for your enthusiasm in helping me welcome the following speaker. He is a professor of environmental change and public health at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. It is with great excitement that I call to the stage Andy Haines, everyone. Can we get a big round of applause? Andy, I would say the floor is all yours.
Well, thanks very much. Do I get to choose the music next time? Thank you very much for inviting me to say a few words about climate change and health. I'm going to focus on really amplifying some of the messages you've already heard. I'm going to do it very succinctly. And although I'm going to talk mainly about the impacts of climate change on health, I want to emphasize that impacts research means nothing if it doesn't translate into action. And I want to emphasize also the need to integrate both adaptation and mitigation. We can't do either one separately. We need both, because there will be limits to adaptation, and if we don't integrate them, we'll also have the danger of having maladaptation, inappropriate adaptation. Unfortunately, the slides don't seem to be working, but it would be nice if they... that's because they've gone... Okay, let's go back. Right. Sorry, I've lost the... It seems to have gone... that's it. Right. So my first slide really tries to summarize what is quite a complex situation. And at the top of the slide, you can see how the increasing accumulation of carbon dioxide and short-lived climate pollutants like methane are causing climate change, which is leading to, of course, increasing extreme events, sea level rise, floods, droughts, and so on. And then through a range of demographic, socioeconomic, and other more local environmental factors, these modify the magnitude and the pattern of risks. As we've heard, the whole planet is at risk, but there are different risks in different locations. And then in the middle of the slide, you can see how different exposure pathways translate into health outcomes. I won't read them all out, but I think we've covered many of them already, at least in outline. They range from the obvious, most direct, heat waves, for example, causing increasing heat-related deaths, difficulties in physical activity, and therefore declines in labor productivity and income, moving through to effects on air pollution, air quality, water quality and quantity, food supply and safety, accelerating undernutrition, vector-borne disease distribution, and ecology. And then finally, on the right side of the slide, the most difficult one to estimate, but probably the most important in the long term, and that's the effects on various social factors, poverty, migration, perhaps conflict as well. So this slide just reminds us that when we put data up, it's often out of date. This slide actually shows us about the attribution of health effects to climate change. It's a few years ago now, and no doubt the situation is even more extreme now. But using the data from my colleagues Antonio Gasparini, who's here today, Ana Vicedo Cabrera, they use data from 43 different sites, different countries, about 700 different sites. And they estimated that about 1/3 of the heat-related deaths over a recent decade could be attributed to climate change. So they weren't just due to natural fluctuations, they were due to human-induced climate change. And that's an important message. Another important message on this slide is that there are big grey areas where we don't have very good data. And that's really vital, that we fill in those gaps, many of them in Africa and Asia. And that means building vital registration systems, embedding climate change into cohort studies, and so on. But we already have very good evidence that climate change is affecting health now. As far as I'm aware, there are about 14 studies actually attributing health effects to climate change. There are hundreds, thousands of studies on climatic factors, but many of them are short-term studies. This just reminds us that there are some groups that are much more vulnerable than others, and this is some work that's being undertaken in West Africa by my colleagues Anna Bonnell and other colleagues in the Gambia. And they're looking at the effects on physiology, of maternal and fetal physiology, of exposures to extreme heat. And on the left side of the slide, you can see how the thermal stress, the heat stress, relates to fetal heart rate. So the wet bulb globe temperature, as that temperature exposure goes up, the fetal heart rate goes up. And that's because the mother is trying to expel heat, blood is being diverted to the skin and probably away from the placenta. And so that's causing impacts on the fetus now, and is likely to be one of the mechanisms by which we're seeing increased pregnancy risks, for example, of premature labor and stillbirth. We also know that climate change is having a range of effects on pathogens, and we've already heard about some of those. But nearly 60% of diseases due to pathogens are climate sensitive. And whilst we know the mechanisms for some of them, like vector-borne diseases, for example, dengue, malaria, we've already heard about, there are others that we don't have so much information about. And some of them are shown on this slide, which shows you the complexity of relationships between climatic hazards and different pathogens. So there's a lot that we need to do to fill in some of the gaps in this agenda and to understand the different infectious disease risks that are relevant to different countries. It's also important to remember that food systems are really an important driver of ill health, and the slide shows you where the productivity of food crops is likely to be reduced, the red areas, in coming decades. You can see that there may be some increases in the northern hemisphere, but that may be transient, we don't know. And the Ukraine war has shown us that it's sometimes difficult to ensure that food supply lines can remain open in the face of conflict and other threats. So this all suggests, as shown on the left side of the slide, climate models show us that crop productivity will decline as the century moves forward, and you can see more red and yellow and amber in those columns as the century moves forward. And this will have major implications for undernutrition, including stunting. Stunting is particularly important because it's not just short stature, it also affects cognitive impairment and therefore the capacity to lead healthy and useful and productive lives. Many climate hazards, of course, have multiplicity of effects, and that's, as Jeremy emphasized in his brief remarks, it's so important to have transdisciplinary, cross-sectoral research. And you can see here that droughts can cause a whole range of different health effects, from nutrition, infectious diseases, effects on healthcare systems, of course, increasing air pollution from dust, and all of this leads to increased morbidity and mortality. And a recent study has suggested that drought in the Horn of Africa, in Somalia, which affected 4.5 million people, was made possibly 100 times more likely because of climate change. That's not just because of the increase Heat, it's also because you get increased evapotranspiration. So crops and natural systems lose their water more rapidly in the face of these extreme climatic conditions. So droughts, floods, and other climate emergencies are going to be increasingly pervasive. And we've already heard really very eloquent statements that mental health effects are very important to understand. We know that if you follow people up after floods, wildfires, droughts, if you follow them up, they have pervasive and long-term mental health impacts on depression, anxiety, and that makes it more difficult for these populations to recover from these extreme events. And we've also heard that climate anxiety is already prevalent in children and young people. And this survey shown on the right side of this slide just reminds us that nearly 50% of young people surveyed in these different countries said they had such severe climate anxiety that it was impacting on their functioning. So we already have warning signals that climate change is affecting mental health. What we don't know so much about is how we can address that, how we can actually reduce some of these mental health impacts and help people to recover from climate emergencies more quickly, and also through active engagement in climate action, whether it be adaptation, mitigation, or both. Does that have an effect on climate anxiety? We don't fully understand the reason, whether that's so or not. There may also be health effects from what's happening in the oceans. This is just one example from Bangladesh, from studies done by colleagues in coastal Bangladesh, showing that there's an unusually high incidence of preeclampsia and hypertension of pregnancy in pregnant women in these coastal regions, and also a lot of hypertension in non-pregnant adults. And you can relate that to the sodium level in the drinking water. So as the sea level rises, the sodium gets into the drinking water, and that can have pervasive health effects. So finding ways in which these coastal populations can adapt to sea level rise will be an important challenge in years to come. And then finally, an oversight, an overview of the mapping of climate and health evidence, because it's important to understand where we are now and where the gaps are in research. And the map on the left here, taken from a paper that some of us were involved with a couple of years ago, led by our colleague Leah Barang-Ford, gives you a map of the climate and health evidence that was available between 2013 and 2020, so it's slightly out of date now, but probably reasonably current. And you can see there are big gaps in the map, which are matched by the gaps on that the heat research that I showed you earlier on. So there's still big gaps in evidence in sub-Saharan Africa and much of Asia. That doesn't mean to say that we don't need more evidence in Europe. We certainly do, because there are still major gaps in our evidence, but there are big geographical disparities. We all can see at the bottom of that slide that there's a big disparity between the impact research and research on potential solutions, adaptation and mitigation. And most of the studies are impact research, a minority are on solutions. And very few of those solution studies, there's an overlap between adaptation and mitigation. So you tend to have them working in silos separately, and what we need is much closer integrated, cross-sectoral, cross-disciplinary research on climate solutions, both adaptation and mitigation, both to avoid maladaptation, but also to ensure that we can get the co-benefits of climate mitigation action through reduced air pollution, through improved diets, improved sustainable transport systems that both reduce emissions, but also improve health in the near term. And then finally, on the right of the slide, you can see how the research breaks down according to country income group. You probably can't read all the detail here, but some of the important messages are the yellow bar is mental health, and you can see there's very little mental health, and what there is of it is in high-income countries, virtually none in low-income countries. There's quite a lot of infectious disease research, particularly in low-income countries, as there should be. Not enough on food and nutrition, and rather little on health systems. It's really important to look at the cross-cutting impacts on the healthcare system, not just on single diseases, but how the healthcare system as a whole functions, particularly as it delivers care to the most disadvantaged and vulnerable populations. So Hajar's looking at me very seriously, so I know I've got to stop, but let me just leave you with the overall message that although the evidence base has grown in recent years, there are still big gaps, and we've illuminated, I think, some of them. But we need to move beyond impact research to the evaluation of adaptation and mitigation actions for research if we're going to really reap the benefits of the research program that we all want to see scaled up. Thank you very much indeed.
I think I looked at you a little too serious, Andy. May I just call you back for 1 minute? Because we did get a lot of questions for you in the Slido. Also, can I just say something that's amazing presentation, by the way, and thank you so much. One thing that really struck me on one of the slides that you showed about mental health and eco-anxiety amongst young people was so there's a story behind it. I do presentations a lot on climate and on sustainability, and this one time there was this man that came up to me and said, yeah, but this is such a Western sort of like fear. It's you people, young people in the Netherlands and the Greta Thunbergs of the world that are worried. But what struck me on the stats that you showed, and I wrote it down when you showed it to us, is that the 3 top countries where young people are most worried and have the most mental health effects when it comes to climate fear is number 1, the Philippines, Brazil, and India, which are countries that are at the very forefront of being hit. They're countries from the global south. So just wanted to point that out because I do think that it really beats the stereotype there.
Absolutely.
And there were a lot of questions also from the audience. Thanks for sending them in, by the way, and keep on doing it. The one that is voted up the most is from somebody that is asking you, Andy, collecting data is key, but how can we make progress on that as long as many countries put a lot of restrictions on data access? Any action to address this, if you could just briefly.
Yeah, well, thanks very much. I mean, it is in countries' self-interest, I think, to be much more open with their data and to share it, because it's only by collective learning that we're really going to move forward.
Yeah.
And that means we need data from all parts of the world, including that's not covered by current research. And I think there's a number of ways of approaching that. One is by improving national registration systems.
Okay.
Because if you don't have national registration of death and causes of death, it's very difficult to do research. And we are, and others are working with national registration offices of national statistics in a number of countries to actually create a much more stable and uniform process for registering and for attributing deaths to climate change. So that's one way forward.
Yeah.
And the other is to fund a lot more integration of climate into the existing cohort and intervention studies. So the intervention and cohort studies that the EU is funding, we should embed climate metrics within those studies, and then we'd be much further forward.
Yeah, very concrete. Thank you also for answering that. I promise I will not look at you as serious as I just did, so that I won't scare you away from the audience. But once more, can I have a big round of applause, everyone, for Andy Haines. Andy, thank you so much. I would say let's go straight into our second presentation, which will be given by Semenza, who is a project leader at Umeå University. Can we have a big round of applause, everyone, for Jan as well? There he is. The floor is all yours. Yeah, I think so. Yeah. I think if you try, it should be on. Test, test, test. I think they're trying to test that. Oh, I think the lectern...
Please put on microphone 1. Is it on?
Oh, you need to do it yourself. Shall I check with you? It's microphone number 1, guys. Test, 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 test. I think it's on.
Perfect.
Okay.
Great.
Do you need a
Thank
clicker?
Hey, thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's an honor to be here, and I've been given this incredibly difficult task to summarize infectious diseases and climate change in 7 minutes. Is this a setup?
Yeah, it is.
How are you going to do this, right?
Absolutely.
It's impossible. Anyway, I'll rush through this, but bear with me. I'm not going to be able to make it. So if you want to address climate change and infectious diseases, you want to look at hazard, vulnerability, exposure in order to get a handle on the risk, right? This is the IPCC framework. And when you think about hazards, we're talking about climate hazards, right? That's heat, drought, rain, and flood. We have spoken about that already. And when you think about vulnerabilities, these are personal vulnerabilities, but also societal vulnerabilities like infrastructure and so on. The good news with this slide is that there is adaptation that can potentially modulate these vulnerabilities to minimize the impact on exposures from foodborne pathogens, vector-borne pathogens, food vector, waterborne pathogens, to minimize that exposure. And that's how I would like to take you through. So I would like to go through these 3 different categories of infectious diseases, just to give you a feeling of what's going on, because I won't be able to do it justice here in 7 minutes. So let's look at foodborne diseases. So this is work we have done at ECDC with Ian Lake and Gordon Nichols. And if you look at the relationship between Campylobacter and temperature, turns out the Campylobacter is the most reported gastrointestinal disease in Europe. So it's a big deal, 120,000 cases in Europe. And you can see that if you cluster the countries together, the northern countries in particular have a strong relationship to temperature. Some other ones as well, but not as pronounced. You can see these are Nordic countries, Scandinavian countries. Some other countries show a relationship with temperature also, other ones might not. And then if you look at temperature, again, the Nordic countries seem to be really have a relationship with precipitation. So when it rains more, we have more Campylobacter, but the other countries don't seem to have that relationship. So if we look at the Nordic countries now and project that forward in time, this is what you get. So here you have Campylobacter projecting it forward in time in the coming decades, and you see a doubling of Campylobacter cases over the coming decades with up to 6,000 excess deaths by 2020 when it comes to the Scandinavian countries. This is not true in other countries, but for Scandinavia, this climate change link seems to be holding true. The next category is vector-borne diseases. You can see I'm going fast. This is West Nile fever. Just let me remind you real quick, how does this work? It turns out that there is a transmission cycle between birds and mosquitoes. Okay, so these mosquitoes, they bite the birds and transmit the virus among the birds. But then it turns out there are different types of mosquitoes. They're called bridge mosquitoes, because guess what? They not just don't bite birds, but they also like humans. So they pick up the virus from a bird and give it over to a human, and we turn out to be dead-end hosts, so our horses, so we don't participate in this transmission cycle. It turns out that we have something like 1,000 cases a year, particularly in the southeastern part of Europe every year. You can see that on this slide here, 2018 was an outlier with 2,000 cases when the epidemic started much earlier in the season and was unprecedented because you had never seen anything like it. Then this work was done by Zia Farok in the lab of Joachim Rocklöf, who's sitting right over here in the front row. And what he identified were the predictors of West Nile fever outbreaks in Europe. And he realized that temperature, like here, the mean temperature of the warmest quarter, the max temperature, the mean temperature, temperature is an overriding driving factor in the transmission of West Nile fever in Europe. It doesn't really hold true in the US, but in Europe, this is true. So we believe that this is a very strong predictor. And when you take that relationship and drive that forward in time, you want to look at, in this column, and this column, you can see that under a mild climate change scenario, you can see from southeastern Europe, it migrates northwestern Europe. And the same thing holds true in a more stronger and more extreme emission climate change scenario, where you can see that West Nile is basically pushing up north and west when it comes to Europe. That, of course, has implications for the blood supply, because a lot of these West Nile fever cases are asymptomatic. So you don't even know that you have West Nile fever. You go and you donate blood, and you contaminate inadvertently the entire blood bank. So this has huge public health implications for the blood safety in Europe. The last category then is waterborne diseases. And again, let's come back to the hazard, vulnerability, and exposure. And in this case, this relationship is a little bit more difficult, because it turns out that if you have an extreme precipitation event, for example, a climate hazard, that can disproportionately impact houses that are in the floodplain, right? A lot of people build their houses in the floodplain, then it rains, and then that house potentially gets flooded, and then you have exposures to the floodwaters, and that is a problem, because once the floodwaters flood a house, all the rats come out. The fecal coliform contaminates the waters. You have all the standing water that breeds mosquito. So there's a cascading risk pathway where one thing leads to another. And of course, that disproportionately impacts vulnerable individuals, those who don't have screens on their windows, those individuals that have pre-existing medical conditions, and so on. And that potentially then can lead to contamination of the floodwaters, where people get exposed to these type of climate events. So it's a cascading event where vulnerabilities in society lead to one thing after another. And that then determines the risk at the heart of this Venn diagram. there are lots of these type of risk pathways. Here is rain and flooding, drought, increasing temperature. Now, obviously not going to go through all of them. Let me give you one example where, for example, a heavy rain event, illustrated here on the left of the cartoon here, where the rain flushes pathogens from the pastures into the rivers. And you have now fecal coliform from these wild animals that contaminated the water intake of the water treatment plant. And because, for example, oocytes of Cryptosporidium can survive chlorination, then these oocytes infiltrate the water distribution system, and you have a big waterborne outbreak. And that's exactly what we saw when we analyzed waterborne outbreaks in Northern Europe, when we analyzed the preceding climatic conditions of these waterborne outbreaks. We could see that if you have an extreme precipitation event, that's like in the 95th percentile, you see a threefold increased risk of these type of waterborne outbreaks because you have contamination of the water supply. So in summary, in Northern Europe, we see an excess of 6,000 excess cases of Campylobacter just due to climate change alone. We see large outbreaks, so the risk for big, large outbreaks for West Nile, particularly in Western Europe. And then again, the waterborne outbreaks lead to these cascading risk pathways where we have societal vulnerabilities, infrastructure vulnerabilities that can make a climate event even more dramatic. And that's where we see these waterborne outbreaks. The question is, what do we do about this? And this is my last slide.
Yeah, that is good.
So here, this is now for waterborne diseases, but this could be true for infectious diseases in general, where I've now mapped out climate hazard on the y-axis here, exposure and vulnerability. And our goal is that we like to reduce that disease burden through mitigation and adaptation to reduce that disease burden. And how do we do that? We need to mitigate, we need to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions, more energy efficient systems. We can reduce exposure through adaptation, where we address the wash system, the sanitation hygiene system. We set up surveillance systems, early warning systems, and regulations to reduce the exposure. And then we can also reduce vulnerabilities by improving access to care, improve the policies, inform, educate, empower communities that potentially at risk for waterborne diseases here in specifically, but for infectious diseases in general. And that's how we would like to drive this process from this cube here to this one here. And that's my email if you have any questions.
My God, can we get a big round of applause? Jan, I bow down to you. This was the most succinct yet dystopian presentation that I've seen squeezed into such a perfect time frame. Thank you so much. In all seriousness though, wow, those were quite some facts and figures, and also quite a grave situation that you illustrated for us. I saw a lot of questions coming in, but there's one from Michael that specifically has been voted up a lot, and he is specifically asking you, looking at processes worldwide, 1.5 degrees is getting unreachable. When shall we admit it and concentrate on 2 degrees Celsius plus adaptation to consequences of failing 1.5? Now, I'm not going to ask you perhaps that question specifically after showcasing what sort of detrimental effects and cascading risks and loops that we're bound to get stuck in if we accept a reality like that. But I think this question, of course, comes from a place of worry. The science is in no way optimistic, and when we see things like this, how do you deal with that, and how should we deal with that, knowing what's at stake?
Good question. And basically, the good news is that there are options where we can intervene, right? It's that last slide has a lot of adaptation options that we can implement,
surveillance.
a lot of research priorities that are laid out that we need to consider. So there are things that we can do. We can build early warning systems where we can monitor climatic conditions that are epidemic precursors of disease to prevent the outbreak from happening in the first place.
Yeah.
So there is stuff that can be done in public health by intervening at the proper times to reduce the potential public health impacts.
Right. So it's also keeping a perspective on what can be done.
Yeah.
Thanks for including that slide. When you said just one more, I thought, please do one more, because we need some solutions as well now. Can we please get a big round of applause, everyone, for Jan Semenza. Jan, thank you so much. I feel like I owe you a cup of coffee and a big gift for doing that so succinctly. I do indeed. But then I will make use of that time that you gave us so efficient, and I'll move on right to the next presentation that we have. And for that, I am incredibly delighted to welcome to the stage from the Lancet Countdown Global, the executive director. Can we have a big round of applause for Marina Romanello, everyone? Where is she? Oh, there she is. And I'll say the floor is all yours.
Is this working? It's a lot of pressure to speak after Sir Andy Haines and Semenza. Thank you so much for those presentations. You've laid the scene and made my job, I think, a bit easier. See, this works. There we go. So I have the privilege of being the executive director of a big collaboration called the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change. We have about 20 people that contribute to the Lancet Countdown on Health and Climate Change here today. So you're going to hear a lot about our work, and they'll go in detail into some of the indicators that I'm going to show you. But I just wanted to acknowledge that the work I'm going to present to you is the product of about 300 collaborators worldwide and about 100 institutions that contribute to this project funded by the Wellcome Trust. And I'm going to present to you today some of the findings of our latest global report, which was published last November. And I will not go into much detail, but just to give you a bit of an overview of what we do, our indicator reports have about 50 indicators that monitor both the health impacts of climate change and the health opportunities of climate action and the health co-benefits of climate action. So what I'm showing to you here, I don't expect you to see this in any level of detail, but just for you to get an idea of what it is that we do, we produce a lot of data that show us what are the current health impacts of climate change, what has been happening in latest years. And across the scope, what we see is that climate change, as you have heard already, is increasingly affecting the health and the well-being of people all around the world. No country is spared. We're seeing heat-related mortality increasing, about 85% since the 90s, more than twice the level expected under constant temperatures. We're seeing heat also affecting morbidity and increasingly undermining people's labor capacity, producing impacts on their well-being, reducing their labor productivity, affecting their income, and importantly, affecting the socioeconomic conditions on which good health depends. The most impacted as a proportion of GDP are also the lower human development index countries, the most vulnerable countries, particularly agricultural workers that have limited opportunities to shield from the heat. We're seeing extreme weather events becoming increasingly frequent. We're seeing also the increased incidence of heat waves and droughts that are leading to more and more levels of food insecurity. About 127 million more people self-reporting food insecurity in latest years than previous decades as a result of these climate-sensitive extreme events. And we're seeing, as you have heard already from Jan, the increase in the transmission of infectious diseases, deadly infectious diseases, that are becoming increasingly suitable. But I want you to see all of these graphics together, because it's important to understand that these impacts don't happen in isolation. They're happening all at the same time, leading to multi-hit scenario, compounding each other. As Jan just said, they lead to cascading effects. And it is undermining the very foundations of physical and mental health and well-being all around the world. This is what we're seeing to date, but we've done projections last report, and we've seen that in every single one of the indicators that we monitor, things are going to get dramatically worse, even in a 2-degree world. So already for the impacts we're seeing today, we need to urgently adapt to the impacts of climate change, increase the resilience of our health systems, and increase our capacity to respond to the hazards as they arise. But urgent mitigation is imperative to ensure that the risks and the threats that we're facing don't exceed our capacity to cope and to adapt. Each ton of carbon dioxide that we continue to emit worsens the outlook. And here's where I went a bit off script, because I cannot just talk about the health impacts of climate change, but I think it's important to talk about the health impacts of our delays in acting to tackle climate change. So looking at the biggest single contributing sector is the energy sector, contributes to about 75% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. And we have to understand that energy is not just a service, it's a health supporting service. It's a service for development, it's a service for health. And what you're seeing here is data that in part comes from the WHO on the use of household energy in the domestic sector. And you can see that 66% of all household energy still comes from dirty, highly polluting fuels. And if you look at Africa, Africa has about more than 80% of the household energy that comes from biomass, highly polluting and a symptom of energy poverty, putting particularly women and girls at risk when they go and source fuel, exposing them to the elements and compounding the impacts of climate change on their health. If you look at Europe, Europe is using over 50% of its domestic energy that is from fossil fuel sources. And this generally is the burning of gas inside people's homes that also contributes to household air pollution. And across 62 countries, we estimate a rate of mortality of 140 deaths per 100,000 from poor indoor air quality, people breathing toxic airs inside their home. These are avoidable deaths. By tackling climate change, we could deliver much healthier air. And looking at outdoor air pollution, we estimate about 2 million deaths from outdoor air pollution, that as you can see in the graph, Europe is the most affected world region in rate of death from outdoor air pollution. There's a recent study that was authored by a few colleagues, including Sir Andy Haines, that estimates this could be 5 times higher than our current estimates. So there's a huge opportunity for us to tackle climate change, deliver cleaner air, better determinants of health, and this is the cost of our inaction. Looking at the food systems, another area that contributes, food systems contribute to about 30% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. 10 million deaths today could be avoided by transitioning to healthier, low-carbon diets. These are unnecessary deaths, and once again, you can see Europe one of the most heavily affected regions by unhealthy diets. So we have an enormous opportunity today. We could be tackling climate change. We could be providing healthier diets, cleaner air, enormous health co-benefits through health-centered, human-centered climate action. We have a lot of data, we have a lot of evidence to back this up. So it just needs political will. I won't bother you with all of this, but just inviting you to see 11 priorities that we put forward with the outcomes of our 50 indicators on what we should be doing in terms of delivering that healthier future for all. And very briefly, just to invite you, in April, we will be launching the Lancet Countdown in Europe reports, which was co-funded by 2 incredible Horizon Europe projects, ID Alert and Catalyze. So stay alert for those, and thank you very much for your attention.
Sort of bring into the room at the end, right, Marina? It's also an opportunity to, you know, flip the switch and make sure that we're not headed for sort of mitigating of negative effects, but we can also see it as a total shift where we make sure that we increase those benefits of a healthy and sustainable world altogether. Thank you for that. There are many questions that came in for you as well. One specifically from Nasser. He was curious on whether or not you could comment on whether there is a trade-off between development, economic growth, and action against climate change, specifically in sort of like sketching that road ahead that we can take.
Well, from analysis that we have done, as well as others, we know that tackling climate change requires capital investment. It requires initial investment to develop the technologies we need. It requires also technology transfer to ensure that the capital and the knowledge for the transition is not restrained to a few countries. And it requires also actions of energy efficiency and more efficient use of resources. Yeah. But what our data shows us is that it pays off within years.
Right.
We did the analysis of the decarbonization of the National Health Service in England, and most of the investments would pay off within 5 years of their implementation. So we know it's enormously cost-effective, particularly when we consider the health benefits that could come from health-centered actions that reduce air pollution and deliver those co-benefits that we've been talking about.
Right.
So it's not really, it's a no-brainer that we should be doing that to enable a livable future and to enable a thriving economy as well.
Okay, I get it. So you're saying it's the growth of specific sustainable sectors and the divestment of more polluting others. Okay, thank you so much. Can we have a big round of applause, everyone, once more for Marina? Thank you so much. And that brings us to the 4th and final speaker for this plenary session. Can I once again ask for your excitement? You keep on giving it to me for free, so I love that. And she's very deserving of it because our next speaker is the executive director from the Pasteur network. I see that she's already here. Can we get a big round of applause, everyone, for Rebecca Grais? Rebecca, the floor is all yours.
Hi, I just want to thank everybody, first of all, for the organizing this. This is not easy, and it's not an easy subject. So unfortunately, I don't think I really got the brief about what I was supposed to talk about. I'm not going to talk about the health impacts of climate change, but more about some issues that were touched on previously, about equity, about connection, about trust, and some potential solutions forward. So the climate's impact on health and the climate crisis is an equity issue. There's inequity in terms of the vulnerability of marginalized communities. Exposure is unequal. There's limited access to healthcare and other social and economic inequities. This is already happening. As the minister mentioned, this is already occurring. It's happening, it happened, it's been a while, whether we recognize it or not. And addressing this without directly incorporating an inequity lens risks to pose a scenario where long-term solutions are not sustainable. So one of the ways to deal with that is to think about networks and about working together. So Dr. Farrar mentioned this, the difficulty in getting people to collaborate and work together. There are many, many networks in the world. I'm going to talk about one. But networks and multilateral action, trust, building that trust and sharing are a potential antidote to some of these massive crises that we all face as a species. Not only climate change, but also the fracturing and difficulties that we have today in terms of wars, fractioning of values, different stresses. Working together multilaterally is a way to address that. On the left-hand side, you see some current challenges, which are not exhaustive at all, and they're in red, which is kind of scary. But those listed there are things that we all face as a community together that we need to come up with a way to address. And networks sometimes are called other things. You can use different words for these, but really what that means is people who are working together and agree to work on a set of principles. And those local solutions that members face in networks drive their action locally, then those are repeated regionally, and then globally. And more often than not, the local challenges that people face are also regional challenges and also global ones. They're just expressed differently, but people don't know. And if we don't talk together about this, it's very difficult to ensure that lessons are shared and these solutions are ones that are brought to the forefront. So one of these networks is the one, and I'll use, I haven't been doing this very long, so I'll take Jeremy's explanation. I'm working on the institutional part. I took over this to try and make a network which has been in existence for 130 years, which was developed over time with a different history, which is around the world, and try and make that word network into something real, where it's not just the word network on paper. So across the world, there are 33 centers. They sometimes carry the name Institut Pasteur, sometimes they don't. Located in 25 countries. We're a non-state actor at the World Health Organization and have about 5,500 papers published annually, an assortment of laboratories, and the core mission of these institutes are to do research, public health, innovation, and education. Each one of these institutions is grounded locally in local laws. The vast majority are a part directly of the Ministry of Health, others the Ministry of Science and Higher Education or its equivalent, and some are foundations or associations. So the question is, how do you get all these people to work together that come from diverse areas around the world and have local problems, have their own issues, and the impact on human health with respect to climate change is diverse and varied. Some are related to heat stress, some are infectious disease related, all relate to mental health, and many of them have extreme difficulties in advocating for the importance of this issue, both locally, regionally, and on a global level. So the way that we decided to put this together was to say that all of this, and this is a kind of complicated graph because it actually goes from the bottom up, you can see the arrows, is that all of that needs to be underpinned with good governance and equity principles. And that's all that's written in pink. Then above that, we decided all of us as a group to focus on those 3 things listed there, the focus pillars. One is on epidemic preparedness and intelligence with a focus on climate-sensitive infectious diseases. The second is everything related to research, development, and innovation in critical diagnostics, vaccines, and therapeutics. And although this didn't come up directly today, this is a climate issue. As we see the world changing, regional manufacturing, regional and indigenous development of products which are adapted to local populations is essential as we move forward. And the last is creating multidisciplinary knowledge communities, and that's been mentioned multiple times. It's not just about biologists, not just about economists, not just about politicians, but we need everybody to work together. And then what we'd like to do is build a broad, highly connected and responsive surveillance network to provide data. And science is one way to do that. Even though there were difficulties during the COVID pandemic, overall, scientists did pretty well, and they tried to work together. There were different problems, but it did work. And so this is one pathway forward. And then above that, those are the impacts that we're trying to work towards reducing climate's impact on health, everything related to AMR, improving mother and child health, access to cost-effective health products, and looking at young researchers, particularly in the Global South. This was mentioned by the ambassadors to COP, and what we'd like to do is make sure that all of these young people in all of these countries also help to see and contribute directly to their future. It's their future, not ours. So, specifically, as a potential solution, and this was also mentioned previously, we're looking at trying to improve early warning systems by having standardized, federated, and transparent data sharing in a platform which allows people to share. And so it's easy to say that, it's really hard to put in practice, but it's very important to at least try. And those include risk maps and reports, which are generated not for scientists, but it is a way for them to be used by policymakers and authorities at the local, regional, and global level. Then the last part, and we had a speaker in the plenary session mention the Climate Health Observatory in Europe. This is a great model. There's lots of models of observatories, but what we'd like to do here is to extend this model to countries and locations where this doesn't yet exist. And this is a way to help build support by ensuring that there's a way to translate information, which often just stays on somebody's computer desktop, into something which can be digested and translated into actionable research. That can range from something like helping local ministries of health or local health practitioners in the timing of certain interventions. For example, we see malaria changes, it's seasonal in some locations. That seasonality is changing. By tracking this data, we can help improve the way that those interventions are delivered. And what we're trying to do also is stimulate and help to advocate for investment in multilateral ventures, in networks of networks. Many of these networks, and this is just one of them, exist already, but encouraging people to invest in connectivity, in the network, in trust building, in all of these intangibles, which are very important, is a way that we can help together move forward. It's tough to fund because no one likes to fund the intangible. They really want to fund something that has a great impact. This will have an impact, it just won't be a short-term one. It'll be one which is sustainable in the long term. And we're starting to do that with the support of the Rockefeller Foundation to extend this observatory model throughout the network, but we need more. And it's not always useful just to have philanthropies. We'd like more and more people to invest in this concept, and that it includes and incorporates all sorts of aspects of society with direct engagement with the populations. Thank you so much, and this is a great meeting, and I hope you're all learning something.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Rebecca. And I will say, please stay with us for a little longer. Thank you for that presentation, because we're hopping right into a short discussion. So if you will, I'd say take a seat. And then I would love to call back our previous speakers. So can we get a big round of applause to rejoin us on the stage for Andy, Jan, and Marina. Where are you? There you are. And where's Marina? Oh, there she is. This is the danger of venturing too far back into the room. It's a long walk. Please, everyone, have a seat. Thank you so much for all your presentations. You know, I actually noticed somewhat of a red thread in all of them, and that is that each and every one of you touched, at least to some extent, about vulnerable groups. And you specifically, you started your presentation off, Rebecca, by mentioning, you know, the topic of equity and the role that it plays. I mean, Andy, you mentioned the disproportionate effects of social factors, poverty. I mean, even in the panel before, Omnia, she mentioned the almost, you could say, intergenerational injustice of the health effects when it comes to the climate crisis. I wanted to ask you, how do we account for that justice element when we look at the research that is out there, the gaps that we need to bridge, but also the action that we consequentially need to take? Marina, I see you nodding profoundly. Would you like to go first?
Yeah, for sure. That is one of the big questions that we still have to answer, how we're going to bridge that inequities gap that is exacerbating because of climate change. One interesting thing is that when we look at the research and do a big literature research of all the research on climate change and health, particularly on the health impacts of climate change and how it's affecting different populations, by and large that research is focused in high-income countries. We still have enormous gaps in the understanding of the vulnerabilities and the impacts being felt in low-middle-income countries, particularly research led by low-middle-income researchers. So as scientists, as researchers, we have a lot of work to do in terms of bridging that gap. And I don't remember who it was that was talking, I think it was Andy in response to a question talking about the problem of lack of data. That's also another big problem that we're facing, is the lack of data of effective impacts of climate change undermines our capacity to be able to identify which are the most vulnerable groups, where the impacts are being felt and how they're changing.
So there's, you are, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think you're touching upon something so fundamental, which is a very big gap, right? It's the disproportionate representation of regions that we're tapping into. Maybe because there's somebody that is actually specifically asking something following up on this. One of the people in the room is asking, and where did the question go? Oh, it's still there, luckily. They're asking, what about the importance of qualitative research to represent the diversity of localized experiences by the most vulnerable groups? I don't know if any of you'd like to touch upon that. Andy, I see you nodding as well. Do you have, and Rebecca, maybe if you want to go second?
Yeah, well, first of all, about the disparities, the inequalities, I mean, I think it's absolutely essential now that the research funders do support much more research in the most vulnerable countries, building up the research capability, not just in those who are going to do the research, but also policymakers who want to use the research, because we need research literate policymakers. And so it's really important to identify the sort of leaders of the future and to support them in understanding how science can be used to influence policy. Particularly in the most vulnerable countries. So that's one issue. And we are seeing, the Wellcome Trust, I know the Medical Research Foundation, which is a small funder in the UK. Hopefully the EU will be increasingly funding researchers and hopefully those who can use research funding as well in the most vulnerable countries. So that's number one. Then qualitative research. Yes, I mean, my background is more kind of quantitative, but I'm a complete convert. You need qualitative and quantitative research. You can't just use numbers. You have to understand where people are at, what are the barriers for taking up the research findings, why they're not being implemented, what are people's perceptions about the impacts of climate change. Otherwise, you can't really undertake research that's relevant to the people who are going to use it. So, yes, of course, we need to integrate the two and see them as a holistic approach.
I love, by the way, how you said that we need to have research literate policymakers. I mean, you said that very fastly, but I think that's actually something for us to take a moment to think about. What does that mean and how can we sort of enable that? You specifically tapped into also the diversity of researchers that you have. I mean, you specifically had a point about young researchers. How do you look at that, Rebecca?
I think there's two things. I think I'll add on to Andy. We also need policy literate scientists. Not just
policy literate scientists.
Yes.
I love this.
And I'm a scientist. Scientists are not always great at communicating to policymakers or to the general public. And so to circle back to the question of equity in young researchers, one of the things that we're doing is trying to launch a program specifically designed with that, which is the ultimatum of a scientist I'm so sorry to do this to everyone. I recognize this is an important currency, is not publishing a paper in a journal. It's ensuring that there is actual translation of that work into something which can concretely be used at the level that it was intended. And in order to do that, young scientists, we need to help them understand more, provide mentorship, provide training about how to translate their work and to have it be policy literate and relevant. And the second component, which I'll add to that, is one of the discourses which is very prevalent, deals with big bets, big changes, big stuff, big risk. Absolutely. But there's also investing in people. And in terms of ensuring that the future itself is one which is something where we explicitly recognize that we are not the ones taking this forward. It is these young people, and their big bets may be different than ours. And they might not necessarily come from a big meeting like this. It might come just by asking them directly, which is my last point about qualitative research. Absolutely qualitative research, but also just asking people.
I like that. That's out of the box, and it sparks something, at least for Jan, because I see you want to comment.
That's exactly it, right? Asking the question, because ultimately, guess what? How do you build resilient communities? If you don't engage the communities, we are not being able to face the problems that are coming down the pipelines, right? So we need to ask the questions, what drives them, what are the issues, and the way I call this lateral public health, as opposed to having a top-down or a bottom-up. A top-down public health, we need to think bottom-up. So we are so used in public health to have these very effective public health interventions where you eradicate smallpox, you solve one problem, and you are extremely effective when you do that. When it comes to polio, right, we eliminate polio. But guess what? These children that don't get affected by polio, they might get a respiratory infection and they die from that because you don't address the underlying issue, which is poverty. So unless you engage the community in how to address the climate risks, we will not get anywhere. So top-down works extremely effective, but for climate change, it has to be bottom-up.
And I see that that's something that really resonates. I see nodding heads, and ahs, so that's always a good sign. Do you have a concrete example of a bottom-up approach in a specific context of which you think that is like a prime copy-paste example that we all should know of?
Yeah, so in Nepal in 2006, there were two little villages on a river.
Right.
And one community was engaged in early warning. They were engaging in how to prepare for a flood, what to get everybody involved if there is an environmental disaster. The other community didn't engage because they were not interested. Then in 2006, there was a big flood. Guess what? In the community where they were engaged in the early warning system, lives were saved. They moved their movable assets out of the harm's way. They saved them. Everybody was engaged in getting the message out and getting everybody out of harm's way. In the other community, thousands of people died. This is like a controlled experiment.
Wow.
Unless you engage the communities, no early warning system is going to work. We can do as much work on sophisticated early warning systems, and if you forget about the communities, it's not going to work. That's the bottom line.
I love that. Thank you also for sharing that. There are many questions that are coming in from the audience. Keep it coming, folks. I love it. Also throughout the rest of today, because a question that we can't fit into this panel, perhaps it will come back later on. There is one specifically which I think taps nicely into, you mentioned at some point, Andy, that, and I quoted it, that most studies are impact research and there's very little on solutions. And of course, we've also talked about the mitigating, the adaptation. There's somebody that specifically asks, beyond impact research, what categories of research do you recommend under efforts towards adaptation and mitigation? I'd like to hear from you, but maybe also, I don't know if you would like to add to that first, Marina?
Just to echo Andy, we're really lacking in the studies of what works, what doesn't, and understanding essentially what works for communities and for people that have to be implementing much of the actions that we're saying. As Jan said, much of it is bottom-up. So there's a lot of community research that we still need to be doing, and I think that will be key moving forward. And looking at implementation of interventions that come from low-middle-income countries where the research, as I said before, hasn't been done yet, and there's a lot still to explore. Research that comes from indigenous knowledge. We have an enormous scarcity of understanding of indigenous knowledge and the wealth of experience that they have as well in adaptation. And we mustn't forget that low-middle-income countries have been adapting to climate change for much longer than we have here in high-income settings. So there's a lot that we still need to learn from tapping onto the knowledge and experience of those that have been at the front line of climate change for so long.
Absolutely. I see a thumbs up coming from Jan. Again, so succinct in your reply. I'm joking. And thank you so much, because I think that that's a paradigm shift as well, and a mentality shift that we need, right? And it's fundamental, I think, what you're mentioning.
And I think going back to the research issue, that research is not traditional research. We have to understand that research is done differently in different settings, and the academic currency needs to be valued very differently when we talk about these topics that impact particularly low-middle-income countries and communities on the ground.
Yeah, good point. Andy, any final comments on that?
Yeah, just a couple of quick comments. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago, my colleague Pauline Schielbeek led a review of what we know about climate adaptation strategies in low middle income countries, and found there were only 2 out of over 1,500 papers, there were only 2 proper evaluations of those strategies. So we're putting money into adaptation and mitigation, but we often don't know what impact that's having. So I think one of the crucial steps here is to evaluate what we're doing. The 100 billion a year is going to be going into climate action, mitigation and adaptation. But actually, it's quite difficult to find out what's been done with the money that's been spent so far. We don't know whether it's having desired impact or not. So what we need to do is to build evaluation into some of this climate action funding. And decision makers often tend to think, well, research or evaluation, it's just a kind of, it's academic pointy heads making an argument for more money for themselves. That may be true, but it's actually much more important than that. It's really, if you don't evaluate, then you really won't know what's going on. And for mitigation, we've just done a big review published in the Lancet before Christmas, the Pathfinder review, and we looked at all the evidence for the health co-benefits of climate mitigation action through reduced air pollution and so on. And what we found is that 90% of the studies are modelling. Now, modelling is important. You need to the mathematical models are very important, but they don't tell you what actually happens on the ground when you try to implement change. So, as Jan says, and others have said, we need interventions that are co-designed with the communities that are going to have to implement them. And we need to spend much more money on implementation and evaluation research that have been kind of Cinderella issues, in the research community. They're not seen as high profile or high prestige. They should be.
Cinderella issues, yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for shedding light on that to all of you, because short but powerful, I would say. I got a lot of lessons out of it. We need to indeed focus on a bottom-up approach, co-design those interventions with the people on the ground. We need to have research-literate policymakers, but also policy-literate scientists. But I think what is underlying in that, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that for the first one, for the research-literate policymakers, we need to know the data, what's out there, and we need to base it on the fundament of those findings and the science behind many things. But at the same time, when we say policy-literate scientists, if you're still following, then we're saying it needs to be accessible, but it also needs to be effective, right? It needs to target something that matters to local communities. And how do we make sure that we do that? The only way that we can know that we need to sort of like tweak in there a little bit is through evaluation. Also a very good point. I hope I did justice with that summary, because, time flies when I'm talking to brilliant minds like yourselves. So I really want to thank you for shedding light on that, for sharing all your insights. And I'm going to ask once more for a big round of applause for all of them. Rebecca, Jan, Andy, and Marina, everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you for presenting and sharing light. Now, we move on to a little bit of a shorter coffee break, but nonetheless still a coffee break. After the coffee break, we will have parallel sessions, so make sure that you know which one you want to attend. You can see the rooms here behind me. Do be wary of the fact that the Jenkins room and the Mansfield room are on the ground floor. And now what is good to mention, everybody listen up, because this is actually quite important, is take a coffee break for the next 10 minutes and then make sure to be at your parallel session. But during the coffee break, you can see some of the posters that are already in the hallway. And if you scan the Slido QR code on your badge, then you can vote for your favorite posters. You'll see that they'll have numbers corresponding to the ones on Slido. And if you vote for your favorite, then we'll have a winner pitch tomorrow that we'll be able to present. So make sure to do that. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back soon. Thank you.